Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Podcast. It's April 22, 2022, and this is episode 775. A few days ago, my wife and I decided to go for a walk in our local park, the Jindai Botanical Park and Gardens here in Chofu, Tokyo. And as is often the case, I took a camera along. The cherry blossom came and went this year without more than a casual glance from my car window while running an errand, which is kind of sad, but it is what it is. With the last few blossom petals turning brown like patches of old snow at the side of the road, the rest of the park is now turning a beautiful spring green. So I decided to see if I could make a few intentional camera movement shots with the trees and spring colour, and ended up with a few shots that I am relatively happy with. I shot some other photos as well, so I'll share some favourites as you accompany us on our walk in the park. We'll work through these in chronological order, starting with this Japanese rose shot. The name Japanese rose doesn't really do a lot for me, and the academic name, Kerria japonica, has a similar non-ring to it. The Japanese call these yamabuki, which conjures up images of spring, and the warm orangey yellow colour carries the same name, so yamabuki feels like a much better fit to me. As you can see, there were a couple of water droplets left from the morning rain, and I also decided to darken down the outer edges of this shot quite a lot as well, to keep the focus on the flower and the texture of the leaves. I was using the new RF 100mm macro with its f2.8 aperture wide open to keep the background nice and soft. I used a shutter speed of 1/120th of a second and selected an ISO of 400 to achieve the optimal exposure, which I checked with the histogram superimposed on the electronic viewfinder, which I have become completely comfortable with. Here is a somewhat more documentary shot, but I wanted to share with you the feeling of the park as we moved from one area to another, and this side path kind of beckoned us in. We usually walk on the larger path to the right of this, but for some reason on this particular day the track seemed more inviting. It's probably because of all of the spring green, which made this area feel brighter than the somewhat darker area that you can see on the right of this image. I also shot this at f2.8, mostly because I was being lazy, but it does give us a sense of depth, with the foreground slightly out of focus. With more light here though, I adjusted the shutter speed to a 100th of a second and ISO 200. Here is the first of the two intentional camera movement shots that I was happy with. They are just trees a little further into the woods, but I was able to avoid including any sky at this spot. If you include the sky, in my opinion, it generally ruins the shot. It's too bright and spoils the overall abstract effect. I changed my aperture to f11 and my shutter speed to a 15th of a second, which is what I needed to give me some long blur as I released the shutter while moving the camera downwards. My ISO was at 500 for the exposure. I actually prefer this next image though, which was a patch of giant bamboo against a dash of spring colour to make it worth shooting. I've tried this kind of shot in other seasons and didn't really like the result. Of course, my favourite is when the ground is covered in snow, but that doesn't happen so often here. I find the bright green at the bottom of the frame quite appealing in this shot though, and the various shades of yellow and brown, and a few green bamboo has come together quite nicely in this shot. I would have preferred it if that patch of leaves towards the top left wasn't there, but I'm still relatively happy with it. My settings were the same as the previous image. I found the colour contrast interesting in this next shot, with a few rusty red maple leaves mixed amongst the fresh green leaves. It was also nice to be in the park pretty much by ourselves, thanks to it being overcast and a little bit on the cold side on the day we visited. I switched to my RF 100 to 500mm lens for a while to pick out some leaves that were too far away to capture with the macro lens, as we can see in this next shot. My favourite part of this shot is the shadow of the smaller leaf towards the end of this patch on the left, which fits perfectly inside the foreground leaves, making it somewhat difficult to understand what's happening. But it's nice to get the two strong shades of green like that, with crisp edges around the darker green shadow. I was also careful with my background, ensuring that the leaves were against the trunk of a larger tree rather than open space, which helps me to keep the shot simple and uncluttered. My settings were f7.1 for 120th of a second at ISO 4000 at 500mm. I did something similar in this next and final image for today, still with the 100 to 500mm lens, but with the focal length slightly shorter at 324mm, and I opened up the aperture to f5.6 for a shallower depth of field to capture these caramel tree leaves. Caramel tree is a nickname for what the Japanese call the katsura tree. These trees smell great though, and hence the nickname, although I have to admit I didn't know these trees had that nickname until I looked up the English to relay to you today. Okay, so we'll start to wrap this up there. I guess my parting message for this episode would be that although it was only a walk in the park, it's important to keep some creative options like intentional camera movement in mind, as these can help to bring a little more enjoyment to our photography. I've been so caught up in the development of PhotoClock Pro and now working on one last update before I start the development of an Android version, so I haven't been able to do much photography in recent months, and that starts to become stressful. Photography has and probably always will be my main form of stress relief in addition to being my main profession. Doing things that we love, regardless of what they are, is always a calming experience, and it was nice to come home and just spend a few hours going through my images and giving them a few tweaks. I also shot a number of tree bark shots which I collect. They actually look pretty good as the background in my PhotoClock Pro app as well, so I'm starting to form an album in Apple Photos so that I can easily drop them into a folder for my background. On that note, last week I shared a video that included a part about integrating PhotoClock Pro with Apple Music, and that has gone well. I am able to start playing the music at a given time like an alarm, but it requires the screen to stay on, although we dim it down completely, so it's working well. I have a little bit more work to do to get it stable and hope to get something in for review in the next few days. So stay tuned if Apple Music integration is something that appeals to you. If not, it's still a great app and works perfectly well without Apple Music. Thanks very much for listening today. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider supporting us on Patreon, which comes with various tiers of benefits depending on your contribution, although all tiers provide access to the full blog posts for more than 770 episodes, as well as access to the MBP community. For further details, check out our Patreon page at mbp.ac/Patreon. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn, and links to everything that I'm up to are at martinbaileyphotography.com, so do drop by and take a look. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, you take care and have a great week, whatever you're doing. Bye bye.